If the disabled community wants a world that's accessible to us, then we must make ideas and experiences of disability accessible to the world. Emily Ladau, Demystifying Disability. You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review on AMI Audio. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. Anyone who's lived with a disability for an extended period of time will know that awkward interactions with able-bodied folks are annoyingly common. Now, we could continue grumbling and lamenting the lack of cultural understanding around disability. I've done exactly that on the show many times. I'm not going to be afraid to admit it. Or we can meet people halfway and make it easier for everyone to learn about disability. Listen, something you hear on AMI all the time is that disability is not a monolith and that they manifest themselves in very different ways from person to person. What that variety means is that blanket statements rarely apply. And when blanket statements don't apply, that introduces a lot of complexity. The disability community needs to grasp that it's not easy to educate yourself overnight about disability and all its implications when you don't live with one yourself. The book we're talking about today is a great introduction to those who are looking to become better allies to the disability community. Niz, who's our guest today, and what are we looking to talk about?
Today, our guest is Emily Ladau. She is a passionate disability rights activist, a writer, a stylist, a digital communications consultant. Her career began at the age of 10, actually, when she appeared on several episodes of Sesame Street to educate kids about life with a physical disability. She is the co host of the Accessible Stall podcast. And today she joins us to talk about her book, Demystifying Disability: What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally. Here's a short synopsis. An approachable guide to being a thoughtful, informed ally to disabled people with actionable steps for what to say and do and what not to do, and how you can help make the world a more accessible and an inclusive place. Jacob, really looking forward to this interview.
Yeah, I am too, and thanks for reading the synopsis. I forgot to introduce you, Niz. Niz is our producer on AMI Audiobook Review. She set this whole thing up. She's joining us from Mississauga. Niz, before we get started, are you personally interested in this book?
Very, very. This is
Mm.
it's very interesting, and I know I get what you were saying in the beginning, that the interactions between people who have a disability and who don't is very awkward, and it's very common, and this is a perfect handbook on important disability issues that people need to know.
Yeah, that's what it is. It's basically a handbook. And we're
Yeah.
so lucky to have the author of the book and the narrator of the audiobook as well. That's really cool. Emily Ladau. Emily, you're joining us from the US. Actually, I should be more specific. Uh, First of all, how are you, and where are you joining us from?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And yes, I am indeed joining you from the US. I am right outside of New York City, just
Hmm.
over the water. And I am doing really well today, and I cannot wait to talk with all of you about this.
And I can't wait to get to know you personally a little better because that's where I want to start before we get into this book. How did you end up making disability advocacy such a central part of your life?
I think it's a really good question to start with.
Hmm.
I was born with my physical disability. It's called Larsen Syndrome. So it's a genetic joint and muscle condition. And my mom and my uncle have the same disability that I do. So it's
Hmm.
always been a part of my life. And I did not really grow up thinking that, disability was a strange or bad thing until I had those ideas introduced to me by the world around me. I think the challenge that I constantly faced was I thought it was a very normal way of being because it was something that I saw in my mom, my uncle, something that was just a part of who I was. And suddenly I had these ideas pushed on me that it was in fact a bad thing, that it was in fact something that made me deserving of being excluded. And I found myself wanting to push back against that narrative. I mean, of course, the understanding that a young kid has of disability is different. And I know you mentioned Sesame Street. So in
Hmm.
hindsight, I think that was really a launching pad for me, but it certainly um was an opportunity for me to see that disability is not something that should be devalued, and it's just something that is
Hmm.
part of a person.
And I think you were 10 years old when you made that appearance on Sesame Street. And I think it's important to start there. Like, what do you remember from that experience? That's so cool.
Gosh, well, first of all, I think that when you are 10 years old and you encounter the puppets from Sesame Street just sort of laying on tables, you're like, oh my goodness, I think you have to grow up a little bit in this moment. But
They're
obviously,
not
that's not
alive.
the disability part.
Just kidding.
Yeah, that sticks with me for sure. But in all sincerity, I think what I remember most is realizing that I was just another kid in the neighborhood on the show. And that was how I wished things actually felt in the rest of my life, where there was no question that I belonged to the community. And of course, having that awareness as a 10-year-old versus having that awareness over 2 decades later in hindsight is a thing in and of itself. But for me, being on Sesame Street was really the opportunity to show other people in my own very small way that disability has a place in any community.
You've been involved in advocacy for close to 2 decades now. And that brings us to this book that published in 2021. It's been about 3 years. There's a statement in the book's preface that I think embodies what I think was your mission statement when writing this book, and I read it off the top of the segment. If the disabled community wants a world that's accessible to us, then we must make ideas and experiences of disability accessible to the world. What did you mean by that?
You got it. That, I like to joke, is my catchphrase, and really
Hmm.
the idea that informs all of the advocacy that I do. I want to be very clear that I don't think that the burden should always be on disabled people to do all of the educating. But at the same time, we don't learn about disability in the ways that we, of course, should be. It's not always well represented in the media, if at all. It's not something that we learn about in history curricula in school. It's not something that we are taught to understand is a normal part of the human experience. So I recognize that there is uncertainty and discomfort around talking about and thinking about and engaging with disability because we haven't been introduced to it as just another part of the fabric of our society. So my goal in all that I do is really to meet people where they are at and say, I want to welcome you to this conversation about disability. I understand that you may be afraid of making a mistake. I understand that you may be unsure about how to think or talk about disability. So, as much as I want the world to be accessible to the disability community, I want to take disability and make it accessible to people who may not have an in depth understanding because they don't have that lived experience.
In that quote that I read, it says, we need to make experiences of disability more accessible to the world. When you say we, are you making reference to the disability community or just society as a whole? And is there an implication here that we, the disability community, haven't done enough to share our experiences?
This is a both and situation.
Mm.
I think that in one sense, I am very much talking to the disability community, but I am also talking to society as a whole. Again, I don't want to put the entire burden on people with disabilities to always have to play the role of educator. I don't think that we need to make ourselves exist in such a way that we're just trying to make other people comfortable with our existence or apologizing for our existence. That's certainly not what I'm asking for. But what I
Hmm.
am saying is that there's often this feeling or assumption that I notice among the disability community that people should just understand an experience that's different than their own. But I don't want to make that assumption about anyone. I'd rather not have anyone assume anything about anyone and instead say, I am willing to share my experiences with you in the hopes that you might have a bit of a better understanding of disability. But this also goes for the world as a whole, because the reality is that no one person is 100% alike. This is true of the disability community. This is true of everyone. There's more than 1 billion disabled people around the world, which means that you
Wow.
have more than 1 billion experiences and opinions when it comes to disability. So there's simply no way that any one person can represent the whole of an experience. So when I say we, it is incumbent upon all of us to do a better job of communicating.
Now I'm curious. In my opening, I said that because there's so much variety in experiences of disability, that introduces a lot of complexity and it makes it difficult for able-bodied people to learn about disability as a whole. Would you agree with that? Do you have any pushback?
I have no pushback. I think that that's 100% right. If you've met one disabled person, then you've met one disabled person. There is simply no way to encompass the whole of the disability experience from any one person. And that's what's most important to me about talking about disability. I don't think I am the expert. I don't think anyone is the expert on any disability but their own. There's so much learning that we
Hmm.
can all do about experiences outside of our own. And certainly, I try to do my absolute best to learn about experiences beyond what I know as someone who is physically disabled, who is a wheelchair user. But I also have a degree of privilege in where I come from. And I recognize that I can't speak for the whole of the disability community. But that also can make it a little bit scary when you think about it, because we're asking people to be more understanding of disability. We're asking people to make the world more accessible. And then we're saying, but there is never going to be one size fits all in terms of a
Yeah.
solution to doing that.
In a way, we're kind of asking a lot in that situation. And that it reflects, in my opinion, in your writing, that you seem, in this book specifically, that you seem to be pretty self-aware at how complex some of the concepts you're describing and explaining here, where you even take breaks and go like, yes, I know that's a lot, but I promise you're allowed to make mistakes. Like, you make these asides like quite a few times in the book. It's very endearing. How did you approach establishing the tone for this book that was like specifically meant for able-bodied people looking to learn?
Well, I really appreciate you taking notice of that. And I'm going to be very
Hmm.
honest. When I got responses to the book, there were many people who said that they felt that I was pandering to non disabled people in the way that I had those asides and those reassurances, as
Oh,
though it's not okay to make people feel more comfortable with a conversation that they're unfamiliar with. But then I had people who felt that somehow I was too radical and too militant. So what I have discovered is that you cannot win with everyone. And my goal was really to find a middle ground where I could be as approachable to as wide a swath of people as possible. And I understand that the tone that I take is not for everyone, but I hope it is for as many people as possible, because I don't want to be alienating. I really want to bring people in. And when I first started writing the book, my goal was to avoid feeling like I was using too much academic jargon, like I was shutting people out. I wanted to write the way that I talk. And the first intro that I wrote, I shared it with my mother, and she said, "This sounds nothing like you. You're trying too hard. Write like you talk
hmm.
to someone."
That's good
And
advice.
so scrapped the whole thing. Yeah, it was great advice, because then I realized I would never talk to someone in a way that talks down to them. So why would I write like that? And I just started thinking and talking aloud and then putting pen to paper. And I said, I want people to feel like they're having a conversation with me, like they're having a conversation with a friend. And I hope that comes through. That doesn't mean I don't want to push people to do the work, but I don't want people to feel afraid to do that work.
You mentioned the introduction to the book, and it does something that I really appreciate in a good work of nonfiction, and that's a good, accurate preface of what the book's mission statement is and what to expect. It makes the rest of the read so much more approachable. And something that's a big part of this book is language. You point out that so many common idioms and expressions relate words associated with disability to negativity, put very simply. Uh, to give you a couple examples, here are a couple sentences like, that movie was so lame. The budget cut will totally cripple the company. He's going into this totally blind, or even things as simple as, that's so dumb. Can you elaborate on why this is so problematic?
I am a language nerd, so I'm really thrilled that you took the conversation in this particular direction. And I think what happens so often is when I start to name some of the ways that discrimination towards disability shows up in the language that we use every day, then people begin to feel overwhelmed and they say, okay, so what am I allowed to say? And it's not that I am trying to dictate how you speak, rather, it's that I'm asking people to be mindful of how they're communicating. We have come to rely on terminology to express things when there are other ways to say the same thing. It's just as easy to say, that movie was terrible. I didn't enjoy that movie, as it
Hmm.
is to say, that movie is lame. It's very easy to say, wow, that was ridiculous or that was silly, rather than saying that was dumb. We don't need to say that we turned a blind eye to something because we can say that we were ignoring it or we were oblivious to it. So there are very easy swaps and alternatives for avoiding using disability as a negative or as an insult, but it's just come to be so commonly used in our language that we think it's acceptable, and we forget that there are real implications because we're using words that refer to people's actual experiences or that have a negative history behind them. So I'm not asking you to be perfect in your language. I'm asking you to be thoughtful and a little more precise in your language.
To be blunt, I know that a lot of people roll their eyes when they're told not to use words like dumb and lame, because those are words that are still
Yeah.
very much part of our lexicon. But I would add that words have been phased out of the regular lexicon, right? It has already been done multiple times. And a good example is the word handicap. And that specific word, I know, and people have asked me directly, like, what's wrong with that word? Because there's a connotation where handicap implies that it's like a disadvantage, but that disability implies that there's like an impossibility, there's no ability. It's, you see the difference, right? So what's the history of the word handicap exactly?
It's a tough one. So there's a lot of conversation about the fact that the word handicapped is supposedly from beggars who had their hand in their cap, or had their
Mm,
cap in their hand rather, excuse me, and were begging for money. And so there's this idea that people with disabilities are handicapped because they are in need, because they are in need of help, support, charity, pity, things like that. My understanding is that that origin has actually been debunked, and it actually comes more from, as you were talking about, this disadvantage. It was from a game that people would play. And they would hold, a cap in their hand. Everybody would have a chance of winning, but some people had certain disadvantages. It also came
mm,
from horse racing, right? So it came from this world that had nothing to do with disability whatsoever. This is my understanding. Again, I think there's some back and forth over the origin of it, but
hmm.
it just doesn't feel to me as straightforward and accurate as disability, because I have many abilities, but then I also have some things that I am just not able to do. And to me, that feels like the most accurate description of what my experience is.
Right. It's like I'm blind. I'm not disadvantaged in sight. I can't see.
Hmm.
It's not like we don't need to beat around the bush in that way, right? So with words like lame and crippled and stupid, do you think it's only a matter of time before those words are considered slurs by the vast majority of people?
I hope so. I hope
Mhm.
so. That's my honest answer. I don't know that we will ever fully evolve away from them, but then again, it's certainly a possibility. I think that right now we have, multiple camps of people. We have the people who think that language is just that, it's words, it doesn't need to have a deeper meaning, it's all semantics. And then you have the people who say no, words matter very much, words are extremely important, they shape how we think, and we need to be careful in how we use them. So I have hope that we will evolve in the direction of eliminating some of these terms from our vocabulary, but I also think that there's going to be a bit of resistance along the way.
You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review on AMI Audio. I'm Jacob Shamansky. I'm talking to Emily Ladau, the author of Demystifying Disability. I wanted to ask about the word handicap because history, disability history, is a big part of this book as well. You go through basically decade by decade, touching on the different milestones and what the quality of life was like for people with disabilities during that time. Why was it important for you to include this history lesson?
Well, first, I will say it was one of the toughest chapters that I had to write because I never set out to write the Bible on disability or the encyclopedia on disability. And there are disability historians who do this work day in and day out, and I am not that. But what I wanted to do was level set and offer some context for what we were talking about, because all of human history is disability history in one way or another. And we need to think about disability as something that has always been a part of our world rather than isolating it to some kind of niche conversation. Disability has always been there, will always be there. And
Hmm.
we need to understand that history as part of our collective history. So I wanted to just bring people through an overview of disability history, but also be very mindful of the fact that there is no way to encompass nearly as much as I wanted to in that chapter. And for that matter, it's US centric, and that is not at all the whole of disability history. Disability history is global. And so I thought if I could just give people a little bit of a primer on history and pique their interest and hope that they would go further and read more and dig a little bit deeper, that would be incredible to me. If I could just get people to understand that there's such a robust history to learn about, and that was just a taste of it.
What I took away from that chapter was basically putting modern advocacy into perspective, showing that extensive advocacy efforts in the past have led to huge improvements in the quality of lives for people with disabilities. In this case specifically, in the lives of American people with disabilities. One thing you do a lot in this book is also give personal anecdotes of you and your mother's experiences with disability. And in your bio, you describe yourself as a storyteller as well. And I'm wondering how you use storytelling as a tool in advocacy.
Oh my gosh, I love this question. I think
Hmm.
stories are how we connect. Stories are how we find either common ground with one another, or if not common ground, at least begin to perceive the humanity in the people around us. And we can provide all of the data there is to offer, but data means nothing if you don't understand the humanity behind it. I often say, as I did earlier in this conversation, that there are more than a billion disabled people around the world, but that number is too large for anyone to possibly grasp what that could mean. And so then let's bring it back. Let's talk about a few people who are part of that billion so that you realize that there's a real person behind every single one of those billion people. And to me, if we can share stories with one another, if we can foster a sense of connection, a sense of understanding, and recognizing that at the end of the day, disability is a natural part of the human experience, that is how we begin to shift attitudes. So, no one's going to respond to a statistic in the same way that they're going to respond to listening to someone's life experience. And I don't mean this in the sense
Hmm.
of pulling at heartstrings. I don't want to exploit the stories of disabled people. Rather, I want disabled people to feel proud of their stories, embrace them, and share them with the world.
What's the difference in being proud of your stories and using the stories of people with disabilities to push a narrative?
Oh my gosh, good question. I see this all the time. I think that people who are well intended or well meaning will use the story of someone with a disability and tweak it just so that you feel compelled to open your wallet and donate, so that you feel like your heartstrings have been tugged upon, like you want to grab the tissue and dab your eyes, like
Mm.
you've been touched. But my question is, have you been moved to actual meaningful action to make the world more accessible, to make the world more inclusive? Or did you just get your daily dose of feeling good? And I think that's really the difference. Are we telling a story because we're trying to evoke an emotional reaction? Or are we telling a story because we're trying to paint a fuller picture of who a person actually is? And there's a big difference there. I think that you can see a disabled person as an object, or you can see them really as the subject, as the main character of their own story.
So, with that in mind, what was ultimately your goal in terms of how you wanted people to take in this book, Demystifying Disability?
My hope is it's just one thing that you engage with in a
Mm.
much broader journey of learning. As I said before, this was not meant to be the encyclopedia on disability, the Bible on disability. I'm not
Hmm.
the expert on disability. I'm just one disabled person. So if you read my book and it's the first thing you've ever read about disability in your life, amazing. And I am floored that you chose my book for that, and also hope that then you will continue reading more things about disability, engaging with more media on disability. But if this was something that you picked up along the way and you already have a working knowledge or lived experience, great. I hope it just adds another reference or tool to an arsenal of references and tools that you can use to engage and share information about disability. So I see this as one point and one book that exists in conversation with so many other narratives of disability.
And you don't just you definitely include a lot of extra reading materials at the end of your book. There's a massive list of a further reading that people who are interested can dive into. And finally, as we wrap up, you've been doing advocacy for disability for the past 20 years. Are you feeling optimistic for the future?
Optimism
Mm.
is challenging sometimes, but what I am
Mm.
feeling is realistic. And that means that I think there is potential for us to make change. I don't think that everything is sunshine and roses. I think that we have a lot that we're all up against in this world, in this climate, and in this culture. But I also think that we have the power to create change. And I often say you can create a policy, but you cannot legislate attitudes. So, as much as I'm focused on systemic change and policy change, what I feel most hopeful about is continuing to shift one heart and mind at a time so that we increase understanding of disability, which will then make the world more accessible and inclusive.
If you weren't optimistic, then what would be driving you to continue with advocacy efforts, right? Emily, I want to thank you so much for writing this book, Demystifying Disability, and also for making time for us today. This was awesome.
Thank you for having me.
That was Emily Ladau, disability rights advocate, storyteller, and author of Demystifying Disability. The audiobook is available on Sela in human narrated audio if you want to check it out. That's all the time for this edition of AMI Audiobook Review. If you missed any of the conversation from the past hour, you can find a repeat of AMI Today on AMI Audio every 8 hours. The show is also available on your favorite podcast platforms. Plus, you can watch the program again on YouTube shortly after the show ends. Thanks for joining us on AMI Today. I was your host, Jacob Chamansky.